He took the microphone at his daughter's graduation and smiled at me like he was about to deliver a compliment. Instead, he said, "Thank you to my wife for raising my mistress's daughter." 200 people went completely silent. I sat there in my dress uniform, staring at the man I'd spent 18 years building a family with. He had just reduced every fever I had sat through, every school pickup, every deployment phone call, every night I'd stayed awake when Emily was sick, to one humiliating sentence. Daniel looked satisfied. He thought he'd finally exposed me. What he didn't know was that Emily had already heard what he'd been saying behind our backs. And when my daughter stood up from the front row, took a step toward the stage, and looked directly at her father, I realized he had made one mistake he could never undo. He had given Emily a microphone. I was 30 when I learned I probably couldn't have children. For 2 years, Daniel and I had tried. There were appointments, tests, needles, calendars marked with dates that seemed more important than anything else in our lives. Then one afternoon, a doctor with kind eyes told me that pregnancy was unlikely. She said it gently, but I understood what she meant. I sat in my car afterward wearing my uniform, staring through the windshield and refusing to cry. 14 years in the army had taught me how to carry things without showing everyone how heavy they were. Daniel knew how much that diagnosis hurt me. At least, I thought he did. We talked about adoption. We talked about waiting. Eventually, we stopped talking about children altogether. Then I came home from a 9-month deployment and found Daniel standing in our living room with a baby in his arms. The baby was his. The mother was a woman named Renee from his office. He told me about the affair, the pregnancy, and the fact that Renee had decided she didn't want to raise the child. He apologized repeatedly, but after a while the word sorry stopped sounding like anything. I wanted a divorce. I meant it. Then I looked at the baby. She was about 8 months old, dark-haired, wide-eyed, and completely innocent of the choices that had brought her into that room. Daniel explained that he had custody and didn't know how he was supposed to raise her alone. I looked at that little girl and realized something simple. She hadn't betrayed me. She hadn't lied to me. She hadn't chosen any of this. So I picked her up. She wrapped her tiny hand around my finger. I named her Emily. That moment changed everything. I stayed. Partly for Emily and partly because I refused to let Daniel's betrayal become the thing that destroyed the rest of my life. For the next 18 years, I raised her. I was there for preschool drop-offs, school projects, parent-teacher meetings, fevers, scraped knees, science fairs, birthdays, and every ordinary Tuesday that nobody takes pictures of. When my military deployments kept me away, I called her every night I could. I told bedtime stories through bad connections and different time zones. When she was 6 and burning with a fever, I stayed beside her all night. When she learned to drive, I sat beside her in an empty parking lot while she stalled the car again and again. I taught her how to change a tire, how to read a lease before signing it, and how to recognize when someone was lying. Daniel was there sometimes, mostly for birthdays, photographs, and the moments that looked good from the outside. Emily never made that distinction. She called me Mom, not stepmom, not Dad's wife. Mom. And every time she said it, something inside me healed a little more. For years, I believed Daniel understood what we had built. Then slowly, he began acting as though raising Emily had been something I owed him. He became more distant, more focused on his career, more interested in appearances than the daily work of being a father. I ignored more than I should have, until Emily heard him say something she was never supposed to hear. Daniel had been speaking privately about me, and he described me as though 18 years of motherhood meant nothing. Natalie was never really her mother. Emily confronted him. She asked the question he couldn't answer. Where were you when I needed someone? He had no answer, because there wasn't one that could survive the truth. And by the time Emily's graduation arrived, Daniel had convinced himself that biology and paperwork mattered more than everything that had happened afterward. He was about to prove exactly how wrong he was. He just didn't know. that the person he intended to humiliate was sitting in the front row beside the daughter. Who knew the truth? By the spring before Emily's graduation, Daniel had started behaving like a man who had already left the marriage. He came home later. His phone suddenly had a passcode. He changed the password on our joint email account and never gave me the new one. Whenever I brought up retirement or the trip to Portugal we'd talked about for years, he changed the subject. At first, I told myself he was simply distracted. Then I started paying attention. There was a business card from a financial advisor in his coat pocket. There were late-night calls. There were conversations that stopped whenever I entered the room. Daniel was preparing for something. I just didn't know exactly what. Then I found the folder. It was in his desk drawer, buried beneath papers I had no reason to touch. Inside was Emily's original birth certificate. Daniel was listed as her biological father. Renee was listed as her biological mother. My name wasn't there. There was no formal adoption decree. No guardianship document giving me the legal status I had assumed my 18 years of parenting had created. For the first time, I understood what Daniel might have been planning. He could point to one piece of paper and tell a completely different story. A judge wouldn't see the night I held Emily for the first time. A document wouldn't remember the fever when she was 6. A birth certificate wouldn't know how many school forms I had signed. It would simply state what it stated. And Daniel had apparently convinced himself that was enough. But there was something he had overlooked. I had kept records. Not because I had spent 18 years planning for a divorce. Because the Army had taught me to document everything. School enrollment forms. Medical consent forms. Insurance records. Emails about Emily's education. Records connected to her college fund. Parenting decisions. Appointments. Every ordinary piece of evidence that had accumulated without me ever imagining I would need it. Daniel saw a birth certificate. I saw 18 years. That distinction became important when I met Diane Whitfield, a family law attorney. A few weeks before Emily's graduation, I brought her everything. The birth certificate. The financial records. The school documents. The medical records. The emails. She went through the file carefully. Then she looked at me. "You have been documenting your entire life without realizing it," she said. That was when I understood the real mistake Daniel had made. He thought my strength was my dependence on him. He believed that because I had stayed for 18 years, I had nowhere else to go. He had even written as much to Renee. "Natalie will never leave. She has nowhere else to go." I read that sentence 3 times. Then I almost laughed. I had spent years serving in the military. I had my own career, my own professional reputation, my own retirement benefits, my own identity. I had not stayed because I was incapable of leaving. I had stayed because I had chosen Emily. There was a difference Daniel had never bothered to understand. And now that choice was about to become the strongest evidence against everything he believed. I didn't ask Diane to destroy Daniel. I didn't want revenge that would turn me into someone I couldn't recognize. I wanted the truth protected. I wanted my legal rights established. I wanted the record to reflect what 18 years of life had actually looked like. Meanwhile, Daniel still believed he was winning. He was making plans. He was preparing his version of the story. He had no idea that the woman he thought had nowhere to go had already stopped waiting for his permission to move forward. I moved into the guest room. I stopped pretending our marriage was intact. When Daniel asked if we could talk, I told him we could talk after the paperwork was filed. For the first time in 18 years, he looked at me differently. Not like a wife who would eventually forgive him. Like someone he could no longer control. But he still didn't understand what was coming. Because the biggest mistake he made wasn't believing the paperwork favored him. It was believing Emily would accept his version of her own childhood. And 3 weeks later, he walked onto a graduation stage carrying a microphone. He thought he was about to tell 200 people who I really was. He had no idea his daughter had already decided to tell them who he was. The graduation ceremony had been perfect until Daniel took the microphone. Emily had just finished her valedictorian speech. She had thanked her teachers, her friends, the people who had helped her get there. Then she looked toward me. She thanked her mother. I lowered my eyes because I could already feel myself getting emotional. 18 years had led to that moment. Then the principal invited Daniel to say a few words. He walked onto the stage smiling. That smile should have warned me. Daniel had always been good at looking comfortable when everyone else was uncomfortable. He took the microphone and looked across the auditorium. Then he found me. I just want to thank my wife Natalie for raising my mistress's daughter all these years. The words landed in a room filled with 200 people. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. For a moment, I couldn't even process what he had said. Then I understood. He hadn't made a careless joke. He had chosen those words. He wanted the room to know that Emily wasn't biologically mine. He wanted to make me feel like an outsider at my own daughter's graduation. And he wanted to make sure everyone knew it. I could have stood up. I could have taken the microphone from him. I could have told the entire room about the birth certificate. About Renee. About the 18 years Daniel had spent letting me do. The work he was now using to embarrass me. But I didn't. I simply sat there. Daniel saw my silence and mistook it for surrender. That was his last mistake. Because Emily stood up. She didn't rush toward the stage. She didn't cry. She simply straightened her gown and walked forward with the same calm confidence she'd shown during her valedictorian speech. Daniel was still holding the microphone. He looked at her, apparently expecting gratitude. Maybe confusion. Maybe embarrassment. He wasn't prepared for certainty. Emily stopped in front of him. Then she spoke. You thanked Mom for raising your mistress's daughter. The microphone carried her voice through the entire auditorium. But you forgot one thing. She turned toward me. And I will remember the look on her face for the rest of my life. There was no hesitation. No uncertainty. Just love. She didn't raise your mistress's daughter. Emily looked back at her father. She raised her daughter. Daniel's expression changed. Not dramatically. That would have been easier to understand. His smile simply disappeared. Emily continued. You weren't there when I was sick. Daniel opened his mouth. She didn't stop. You weren't there when I was afraid. The room remained completely silent. You weren't the one waiting outside my school when I forgot my ride. Daniel lowered the microphone slightly. Emily kept going. You weren't the one who taught me what it means to keep a promise. Every sentence was something Daniel could not argue with. Because none of it was an opinion. It was her life. It was 18 years of memories. And every person in that room was hearing the difference between being someone's biological father and actually being there for them. Daniel had wanted to define my relationship with Emily using 5 humiliating words. Emily was defining it using 18 years of truth. Then she delivered the sentence that finally broke whatever remained of his confidence. So, if you're embarrassed that Mom raised your daughter, you should be embarrassed that you didn't. Daniel said nothing. There was nothing he could say. He had wanted to expose me. Instead, his own daughter had exposed the truth. Then Emily turned away from him. She looked at me, and her voice softened. I'm not your mistress's daughter anymore. She paused. I'm Mom's daughter. That was the moment Daniel finally understood. He hadn't been standing on that stage with control over the story. He had been standing there with a microphone in his hand, giving his daughter the exact platform she needed to correct him. The same microphone he had used to humiliate me had become the instrument. That restored my place in Emily's life. He had tried to make me look like a woman who had spent 18 years raising someone else's child. Emily made it clear that I had spent 18 years raising my daughter. Daniel had expected me to fight him. I didn't need to. He had already handed the microphone to the one person whose answer mattered most. Daniel found me in the parking lot after the ceremony. Emily was still inside with her friends and teachers, surrounded by people congratulating her on the future she had worked so hard to build. Daniel looked different. The confidence was gone. The smile was gone. For the first time in 18 years, he looked like a man who had finally realized that everyone else had understood something he hadn't. He walked toward me slowly. I made a mistake, he said. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I answered, No, Daniel. You made choices. That was all I said. Because a mistake is something that happens once. Daniel had made choices for years. He chose distance. He chose appearances. He chose to let me carry responsibilities he should have shared. And on that stage, he chose to humiliate the woman who had spent 18 years loving his daughter. The difference mattered. I didn't need to punish him. I didn't need to embarrass him again. I didn't need to tell anyone what kind of man he had been. His own choices had already done that. The divorce moved forward quietly. There were lawyers, documents, financial records, and difficult conversations, but there was no dramatic revenge. The assets were divided according to the law. I took what was legally mine. Nothing more. Nothing less. The records I'd kept for 18 years helped establish the reality of what I had contributed to our family. But I never wanted the process to become a campaign against Daniel. I wanted an ending. And more than anything, I wanted Emily to walk into adulthood without carrying the weight of our marriage on her shoulders. Daniel lost something no court could divide. Emily's trust. She didn't cut him out with one dramatic announcement. She simply became more distant. The calls became shorter. The visits became less frequent. There was a wall between them now. And Daniel had built it one absence at a time. Renee didn't become the family solution Daniel may have imagined either. Whatever relationship he hoped to rebuild with her never became the future he had apparently planned. Meanwhile, Emily never changed the one thing that mattered most to me. She still called me Mom. Not because I demanded it. Not because anyone told her she should. Because that was who I had been to her for 18 years. A few months later, Emily left for college. We packed her dorm room into the back of my car, trying not to cry during the entire drive. Before she walked into the building, she handed me a small wrapped package. Inside was a framed photograph from her graduation. It was a picture of the two of us laughing. Underneath it was a single sentence. You didn't give birth to me. You gave me a life. I stood there holding that frame and cried harder than I had in years. Not because I was sad. Because suddenly I understood something I had spent 18 years trying to explain to myself. That doctor had once told me I probably couldn't become a mother. I had believed those words meant one door had closed. I was wrong. Motherhood had never been about the moment a child entered your body. It was about what happened after. It was the nights beside a fever. The school forms. The missed sleep. The phone calls from another time zone. The driving lessons. The promises kept when nobody was watching. It was choosing the same child again and again. Especially when walking away would have been easier. Daniel thought he was exposing me that day. He thought the words, mistress's daughter, would make me smaller. Instead, he gave Emily a stage. He gave her a microphone. And he gave her the opportunity to tell 200 people something I had never needed to prove. I was her mother because she knew I was. And sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't destroying the person who hurt you. Sometimes it's walking away with your dignity intact while the truth speaks for itself. Daniel wanted everyone to remember the woman who wasn't Emily's biological mother. Instead, they remembered the father who had finally been told the truth by his own daughter. And I never had to raise my voice once. If this story stayed with you, remember this the next time someone tries to reduce years of sacrifice to a single sentence. People can rewrite a story. They can manipulate appearances. They can point to a piece of paper and pretend it explains everything. But they cannot erase 18 years of choices. And when the truth finally gets a microphone, you may not have to say a word. Because sometimes the person who knows the truth best is the one standing beside you. If you want another story about someone who thought the paperwork gave them all the power, stay with me. The next story proves that sometimes the person holding the document is the last person who understands what it actually says.